Amazing. So, let's start.
Yeah.
Ok, comenzamos entonces. Va a ser una presentación, una charla en inglés, español y seguramente un poquito de Spanglish también. Entonces, si Susy nació en Estados Unidos, pero tiene raíces mexicanas, entonces ella habla español. Entonces, al final, si quieren preguntarle algo en español, si les resulta más fácil, adelante, ¿no? No hay ningún problema. O si de repente quedaron dudas o preguntas sobre algo que haya dicho que no haya quedado como claro, ¿no? Que quieran como aclararlo con ella. Entonces, iniciamos. Susy Bilak is a Chicago-based artist and writer, curator, and cultural producer, and educator with expertise in cross-disciplinary collaboration, public engagement, and research. As an artist and writer, she responds to issues including migration, displacement, and the relationship between domestic life and disaster. With roots in Jewish, Mexican, and Eastern European diasporas, she continually engaged hybridity and the multiple in her work, hybrid identities and forms, multiple histories and perspectives. Her projects have ranged from engravings on kitchen tabletops to language-based participatory games, to drawings with her breath. Recent and forthcoming residencies include Chicago Artist Coalition, Grand Central Art Center, Oxbox, Rechdale, and Rogers Art Loft. Her work has been collected and exhibited widely, including by the International Print Center, Museo Tamayo, San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, and Walker Art Center. Her visual art and writing have been published in art papers, poetry magazines, and New American Paintings, among others. She received an MFA from the University of California, San Diego. Bienvenida, Susy, un gustazo tenerte por acá y te escuchamos.
Perfecto, mira, mil gracias, Nuria. Y como Nuria dije, voy a hacerlo mi charla en inglés, pero también podemos charlar y hablar en español, porque soy escritora, es más fácil para mí porque escribo en inglés, hablar también en inglés, pero voy a mezclar nuestros idiomas. So Nuria, thank you for that welcome and for having me, all of you. I'm really glad to be meeting you from a distance and hope to do so in person. Today, I'm going to talk through a number of projects. And as I told a couple of your professors and colleagues, there's a lot of them. So depending on, we can pause and dig more deeply into a few of them. But the title of my talk, Edificios Revisados, is inspired by a project that I did, and it comes from my enduring research interest in architecture. And this is from the scale of the living room to a city, and how it connects to larger themes of memory, stabilization, and belonging. And I'm going to share a number of projects. You see here some visuals from those different projects. And before talking about them one by one, I want to share a little bit about my motivation, which came out a bit in the introduction that Nuria shared. So I was born in Mexico City, where most of my family is now. And I grew up in a diasporic Latin American and Jewish community, a set of immigrant communities in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the States, at a time when Pittsburgh was undergoing massive deindustrialization. And that context is what spurred what has been an ongoing drive in the interplay of people and place and the politics of space. The focus of my studio practice, my work is also relational and very much driven by social and public practice, but my studio practice is driven by the expressive power of material and the potency of social issues, and working to find the poetics in between those two things. So the first project that I'm going to talk about is one that's ongoing, which is Cuarto de Estar. and I'll share it as a primary example of my practice. I embarked on a project a few years ago when I was commissioned to create an installation in response to the Jewish holiday of Sukkot and related themes, including the cyclical history of migration. Some of you might know that this holiday, which celebrates the bounty of the fall harvest, also commemorates the exodus.
Se desconectó ya, ¿no? Susy.
Sí, ¿verdad? Se le cayó la... Nos entraron recuerdos de pandemia, ¿no? Bien.
We cannot hear you. Well, you have to turn on.
Ok, ¿ya pueden oírme?
Sí.
Ok, ¿ya pueden ver mi presentación?
Sí.
Oye, Miguel.
Ok, déjame ver si puedo hacer... Upsi, así no. Pero... ¿Y ya pueden ver?
Creo que
¿Ya
ahora-
pueden ver o no?
Danos un segunditito.
No, ahí no se puede, ahí no se ve tu. Ahí está, ahí
Ok,
está.
Ahí está.
Ahí está, a ver.
Pero se ve otra vez
A
como
ver.
PowerPoint. A ver.
Espera, sigo.
No. Estamos teniendo problemas.
Al final sí se deja ver.
Ya.
¿ya pueden ver o no?
Ahí está,
Ahí
sí.
está.
Ya.
Ok, gracias. Empezamos otra vez. I think that where I cut out was telling you that when I got this invitation to do a project in relationship to this holiday, something I'll note is that while I'm now including a kind of identity and identity politics in my work, this is only very recent. And what motivated it is really what's going on in the climate of the US and the world. And the moment that we're living in white nationalism, including anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment, that is really what's motivated me to take this up in my own work. And I've been turning towards autobiographical material. And so with that in mind, I decided to develop an installation centered on Bradley 46, which is a home in Colonia Anzures in Mexico City that my paternal grandparents built in the 1940s. This is long after they emigrated to Mexico from Poland, which they did in the 19-teens. In 1940, though, when they built their house, it wasn't, or the 1940s, it wasn't long after my grandfather had lost his entire family in Poland. This house was the second on its block and built by my grandparents who'd first come to Mexico seeking a more viable life. Bradley 46 was sold by my father and his brothers in the 1990s, unable to continue upkeep after their parents' death, unable to afford it. So after they sold it, this house just lived in imaginary. And what I hold is the muscle memory of running up and down the curved staircase that defined the living room, the sensation of light flooding the room. I recall the small still life paintings that my great aunt Regina made before she went blind, a teapot, chrysanthemum bouquets, and tableau in the style of Remedios Varo. I remember the atmospherics of bodies and food in the home. In my research to develop my installation, I dove into conversations and readings. My conversations included talking with rabbis, fellow artists, and fabricators. With another artist, Sarah Noah Mark, we discussed the sukkah, that architectural structure, as a place that holds the memory of wandering. For me, the idea of home and domestic objects do the same thing. This is a photograph I took of my father listening to a needlepoint his mother created a study for another project. Within my research, I connected to the work of Marianne Hirsch, a scholar of feminist theory and memory studies. My concrete memories of Bradley 46 are interwoven with what she describes as post-memory, the stories, images, and behaviors among which I grew up and which I've absorbed. What Hirsch coined as post-memory in reference to the Holocaust, for me more broadly references conditions of diaspora and immigration, where post-memory, the stories that we hear from others that substitute in for become our own memories, is resonant not only for accessing and relating to memories colored by trauma, but also those written in joy. As Vicky Fung-Smith describes, Cuarto de Estar evokes post-memory as the place where the personal, familial, ancestral, cultural, and collective are indistinguishable. This post-memory becomes an integral part of a person's identity, a way to cope with grief and loss, a way to keep their past alive and tangible. So in developing this project, I was working with the material of memory. The images in the sculptural works in Cuarto de Estar that I showed briefly and we're going to see again are based on photographs my father and I respectively took 40, in this case, and 20 years ago, that I found in snapshots and slides. This image of my hands holding a slide of a photograph my father took repeats. It staggers or stutters the way memory jumps and extends. In developing an installation centered on a living room, I had a few motives. I was interested in creating an installation that would hold the viewer. The wallpaper is intended to do this. I was keen to domesticate the space of the gallery and envelop the viewer. Water and wine, libations, are a big part of the rituals of Sukkot. One repeating image in the wallpaper is a Jewish glass vessel from the 6th century that I painted with my breath. The other repeating image in the wallpaper is a mixed media floral painting. I included this inspired by the proliferation of floral wallpaper that we see everywhere in the world, and more specifically, my great aunt's still life paintings. On the subject of design, I consulted with a pattern expert to move from this first mock-up to the final design that you see here. And now, as this image also demonstrates, in Cuarto de Estar, parallel to working with memory and breath as material, I'm also working with light through mirrors and photographs, translucency and color, to think about the reflection and refraction of distant pasts. One of the facets of Sukkot is to welcome ancestors and strangers alike. I wanted viewers to become part of the project itself. I also wanted to bring in the memory of my ancestors, specifically my paternal grandparents. I remember growing up having conversations with my grandmother by her dresser mirror. Like many of us from diaspora, I have little material record from my ancestors. So for Cuarto de Estar, I sourced vintage dresser mirrors. These mirrors, you can see a few here, stand in for my grandmother's mirror and invite viewers into the piece itself. And just as the theme of architecture traces through my work, another through line is working with furniture, thinking about how domestic objects can stand in for relationships and carry their own histories. In Cuarto de Estar, I'm drawing upon a few other projects, which I'll briefly share here, starting with Edificios Revisados, after which this talk is named. So Edificios Revisados is a project that I created in relationship to the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. For that project, I focused on the relationship between natural disaster and domestic life. You can see here a bit of the detail. I drew these carving into this very unforgiving surface of this plastic formica and cutting through, digging through to all of the layers below. I was interested in taking up the kitchen table, a modern day center or hearth of the home, as this protagonist for the project. And so you can see this detail of the table, these hung like paintings on the gallery wall. Another project that I'm drawing on for Cuarto de Estar is this series of breath drawings. So the jug painting that I made is drawn with my breath. So I'm using very elaborate stenciling and then using that stenciling. So this isn't just like an abstraction. So this piece is part of a series of images, and the shape some of you might recognize is very similar to those we see in a lot of huipiles. So the huipil is the first reference that I'm thinking about with this piece. And the second reference that I'm thinking about, some of you may know that there is a tradition in Judaism of placing a stone on a gravestone as an act of commemoration, kind of physically calling up and thinking about and honoring the dead. And in the time of COVID, I returned to this series. I live by Lake Michigan, which is this oceanic lake where Nuria and I first met by Lake Michigan. And when COVID began, I was beachcombing every day for stones. And I began making these paintings with my breath, where I think of them as acts of memorialization, as mantles of light, as shields. And I began them in that first phase of COVID, when we were all in the state of bewilderment, not really knowing what happened or what was happening. And for me, this was a ritual for myself and a way of really thinking about this accruing loss. For Cuarto de Estar, painting ancient vessels with my breath felt like a really appropriate medium. Now, what I just showed you, the installation, is the first in an ongoing series of Cuarto de Estar. And the second, Segundo Piso, I mounted last spring. Now, for this second chapter of Cuarto de Estar, Segundo Piso, the anchor is this large painting that you see. And this is a watercolor that began small, not this small, but this small. That I then scanned and blew up to 8 by 20 feet. This is as large as a room. And this is a reproduction of this watercolor that I painted after my parents' 1970s living room in Colonia del Valle in Mexico City. And as with that image of my hand holding a slide and how that slide repeated, this image repeats too, where I'm thinking again of the function of memory and how memories often stagger, stutter. We know memories through the fragments that we hold on and how they repeat. And we can see here too the way that the image refracts around the room. Segundo Piso also includes reproductions of 2 small paintings featuring shells, another kind of home. The one on the left is a still life painted by my great aunt Regina in the 1950s. And the one on the right, I painted for the exhibition. So you can get a little bit of a sense of material play. And in this talk, I'm going to show you some of the very different kinds of ways I'm working. And sound is coming up for those interested. And for anybody interested in writing, here we go. So for this project, I was addressing architecture through language and the body. What I'm showing you is Noticeable Effects, which is a kind of visual poem that reimagines the Beaufort scale. And this is a piece of scientific writing that is a forecasting tool. So it goes from a scale of calm to total devastation. And the original piece of language tracks the movement of the wind on water and on land. And when I encountered this really beautiful, strange piece of writing, I thought, instead of measuring the impact of wind on land and sea, I want to rewrite it for the psyche and think about how the wind relates to the body and the home. And so this was my first collaboration with my partner in art and life, Fred Schmaltz. And we first created this visual poem, and then we were invited to reimagine it as a game. And this was for a Fluxus-inspired exhibition in conjunction with the Havana Biennial. Now, when we were invited, it was shortly after Havana had been, and many people living in Havana had been hit by a hurricane. And we really wondered whether or not to bring the show. And the curators and different people involved said, please bring it. We think this could be useful. And as described by the people who then experienced the game, they described it as an absurd and therapeutic tool for people to inhabit. So what we did is we had this game where there were dozens of prompts. This was translated into Spanish, and people inhabited these different actions. So here, a woman is responding to the prompt, occupy a doorway, touching each side of the frame. You are a spider web, trembling. And going back to the game, it goes from a scale of calm to total devastation. And so thinking both about the body and the home, my partner and I rewrote these very kind of flat descriptions of how a tree branch moves, but kept the same kind of tone or register, but thought about the way that destruction and devastation can work on our own lives when we are fighting with our family, or when things are dissolving, or when things are coming together, how we buttress each other and hold each other up. So that's noticeable effects. And now with that, I'm going to bring us to a different project that's taking up architecture and language with video and music. And this is the world inside this one. So when this project began, it began with chance. So if you can imagine going on a walk on a spring afternoon, my partner and I were going on a walk and we smelled lilacs. And some of you might know and be familiar with how overwhelming the smell is. You can smell these flowers from a block away. And when we encountered this wall of color, I had this image of immersing myself in this floral barrier, which would be uncomfortable because I have very severe allergies. But knowing that lilacs are temporal, in Chicago, these flowers blossom and disappear within a week or two. We got up at 5 the next morning and went out and did this video shoot. And I repeatedly entered and emerged from this lilac bush, which you'll see in just a second in a video. In a recent interview, somebody asked me whether form or concept comes first in my shared and collective practices. It goes both ways. Usually the ideas for me come first, but in this case, sometimes an image comes and the ideas come afterwards. Before I know what something is about, the image wants to come into being. So Fred and I recorded this video, and then about half a year later, Lisa Kaplan and Matthew Duvall, who are the co-founders of this phenomenal ensemble called Eighth Blackbird, approached us to be in residence with them and to incubate a new collaboration. We'd had a really kind of wild and wonderful conversation about how we might develop something together, where we were talking about melting glaciers and climate change and the intricacies of sound. But when they approached us, it was during the pandemic, and we were all thinking about home. And this may resonate with some of you or all of you, but in the time of COVID, things got really small. And we were really focused on our homes and the idea of confinement. And so we were tuning into the porosity of the home and our neighborhood. We did a bunch of research learning about how things move in and out of the home. We learned about the thousands of organisms that exist within the home and enter and leave it. Rather than thinking about the home as a container, we thought of the home like a character. And we approached the home through quotidian movement, repeated actions, discomfort, quiet, absurdity, and tenderness. And we developed a piece in 4 movements that gravitated around poetry, videos, and music. And now I'm going to ask me if I move to Vimeo. I'm going to show you a fragment of the piece, and we can then talk about it later. So I'm going to stop this and then share my Vimeo. Déjame ver. Okay. And let me turn this up. For the musicians in the audience, I just want to make sure that the sound is loud.
Is there music now? We cannot hear.
Oh dear. Yeah, there is music. There's music and spoken word. You can't hear it?
No.
Okay, let's start again. I think maybe I didn't enable it. Okay. Share sound. All right. No. No. ¿Dónde estoy? Okay, I'm just trying to get us to the video.
Or probably you can send me the Vimeo link and I can open that here.
Sure. Let me do that. Let me just try one more time because I just hadn't shared the sound. I just didn't find this should work. Okay, do you see this now?
No, no,
N-
it's happening
no?
the same. No. Oh, yeah, there.
Do you hear?
Yes.
Okay. Is it loud?
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay. This is 7 minutes long, just so that you have a sense.
On the day the world ends, the cell phone store across the way flickers open. A fallow orchid declares its first bud in months. On the day a woman queues up at the clinic awaiting a test, her breath turns into a stop-motion film of flowers, popping blooms, stamens at full burst, pistils pollen flush, wet-headed poppy, spider mum among pink peonies. On the day the world ends, a dog walks its own shadow into the grooves of the road. The world ends to the hall vacuum's drone. We feel the apartment's contours, hats, gloves, scarves piled in a carton. Neighbors' murmurs slip under the door.
When we vacuum away the salt tracked in with traces of fallen snow, the lake's fleshy swell and its gust and bluster also enter, both accumulation and scrape. Silt shifts into the apartment, an errant spray. Bay windows witness the neighbor building's crumbling brickwork beset by wind abrasions. Brick becomes sand, boring at the windows and doors.
In morning light, particles stir in topographic clusters, interlocking hairs, small glass shards, ideas left over. I feel about me the unsung dander distributed along surfaces. No matter your vigor in trying to protect our pillows, we can only do so much. Dust beds down into every surface facing the ceiling. Did the mites in the rug hear us argue over our pasts? Pressure and pleasure lie atop each other on the rug. They take turns, listening for crickets we know are months from returning to the field behind the porch.
Year of grease, year of smoke, year our gloved hands fire with abrasions. The neighbor's grown child wipes the year off each surface of their house. methodical, the cleaning of corners, attending to ridges and railings, to the belly of each vessel and vase. Then every possession carted to the lawn. Yes, it's warmer there. Sun in water bowls, sun on piles of rags. Each item faces the family's judgment. What comes back inside, what remains on the street. Blue and brown shadows form and dissipate. I will be a goal for you, will hold still until by will and light you cover me. From the street, none of the neighbors will see. Inside me always something temperate, the seam nature ends along, as it endures season after season in the apartment across the way. We too can go dormant through winter, all brittle and sand. The succulents, pale in their pots, hold on in their paper suits intended to burn beneath a sagging roof's xylophone of icicles.
So I want to pause now, knowing that there are a bunch of musicians in the room, and I will share that what you just heard was a recording from a live performance. So we did this in COVID when we couldn't be with a live audience in person. So what we were invited to do by our musician collaborator friends was to develop a new work together, where Fred and I developed all of the language, and we also created this suite of videos. And then we rehearsed for over a period of 3 weeks, pretty intensively in the studio. And our friends are Grammy Award-winning musicians. They're incredible. They are phenomenal in their craft and in improvisation. And they were responding to our language in the videos. And then we went back and forth with the kind of mood that we wanted to achieve, and then develop the piece together live. Our goal is to develop a full-length feature work for stage to show in multidisciplinary centers. So what you're seeing is that was us reading, where we were speaking as they were playing for a video audience from around the world. So that is some context to that piece for anybody who's interested in collaboration, and especially the musicians in the room. I wanted to share that. And there's a few other projects I want to share, but I just want to pause because I've already shared a lot to see if there are any questions at this juncture before I keep going.
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta que le quiera hacer a Susy sobre lo que ha mostrado hasta ahora? Estas piezas colaborativas entre poetas, músicos y artistas visuales, sobre el trabajo previo que presentó de migración, arquitectura, objetos encontrados, memoria.
Yo sé que hay mucho aquí y todavía tenemos más.
¿Seguimos entonces? Nadie quiere hacer una pregunta. Aquí sí hay una pregunta.
Yo tengo una pregunta más sobre, siento que usas la memoria como tu materia prima, por así decirlo. ¿Cuál es tu proceso como para resignificar todas estas memorias y materializarlas? Porque siento que es algo a lo que todos tenemos acceso, todas estas memorias, pero ¿cómo lo resignificas tú para darles un sentido artístico?
Ok, déjame ver. ¿Está bien si hablo en inglés para responder? Okay. I think that this is a really important question, and something that I often think about and I talk about with my students is the question of what is for you as an artist? What are you working on and working out? What then translates? What are you committed to being there for your audience? And in my case, I'm very interested in making work that people can meet in their own terms, so that the signifiers are going to be very different for different people. My hope is in the projects that I described in the Cuarto de Estar and Segundo Piso to include materials that might call up for other people their own set or constellation of memories and relationships. And so for me, having certain materials like the mirrors, and light and color in conjunction with, I'll note as a small aside that it's very rare for me to work autobiographically, historically. This is the first time, other than many years ago, I have a twin sister and we collaborated on a project many years ago, that typically I take on more universal, sometimes overwhelmingly large topics and themes, like the relationship between domestic life and natural disaster. And that had to do with having my life very personally impacted by it. I'm often touched by the subjects, but in this case, it took me a while to come to this project. It took me about at least a year or two after thinking about this question of how to translate memory and how to bridge that gap. I've had many conversations with people about the work, and I think for some, the installations are very evocative and they evoke people's own wildly different experiences and life stories. And for others, they may not get memory from the work. My hope with the piece is to use that as you picked up, I'm very invested in what materials hold. And so for me, something that I spoke about a lot with people from different diasporas, but then also people who had been forcibly displaced, or people with hybrid identities, that there was a lot of relation in this idea of adopting something from a thrift shop, from somewhere else, and charging it with our own meaning. That was something that a lot of people related to, so that they might not relate to the image of me or my sister in a space, but it called up for them an idea or memory of them sitting in a home from their own life. And that this idea of how do we appropriate and take up materials and also invite in the histories that we can't know from those objects was something that was also functioning in this project, and that I've thought about in work, which is the function of reusing objects that may have storied lives that we don't have access to. That was a multifaceted answer. I hope that it addressed your question.
¿Alguien
De
más
nada.
quiere romper la barrera? Seguimos entonces, Susy.
Sí, ok.
mí sí, sí.
Sí. Ok. Pienso que... No, esto no. ¿Cómo lo hicimos? Así. Y así. Ok. No, sí.
Ahí
Sí.
sí.
¿Ya estamos? Ok, muy bien. So I won't talk about this too much, but I will just say that as you can see in a lot of my projects, there are many different ideas and themes going on. And I'm thinking still about that really wonderful question. And I'll say that knowing that my ideas are often, or the projects often have many different components, it's kind of like a puzzle or a poem. How do you go from this much material to hone in on a few pieces? And so the biggest theme underpinning this project was mortality, how living things, plants, animal, people, all contend with mortality. They all have life cycles. And so the first chapter of this project, The World Inside This One, was focusing on that. The second movement, the language is really thinking about living and non-living objects and entropy and order. And so this ridiculous movement of Fred getting out from the confinement was kind of embodying entrapment, confinement. And then here, as we think about past, present, and future lives of the home and the stories home tell, the residue of those who pass through, we get absurd. And then in this fourth and final movement, we use the objects of home as resonant bodies. So with this, I'm going to bring us to the last project that I'll share with you today, which is Vacancies, that maps the ghost of one building to another. So Fred and I created this project Vacancies, and here you're seeing the two parts of it for an exhibition that considered the interdependence of human wellness and constructed notions of place. And for many years before this exhibition, we'd been using hotels as a way to think about cities, and that hotels are a microcosm of urban life and a stage where dynamics of class, gender, and race often unfold. So we had been thinking about the hotel as a collision point. Some of you might recognize this still from a Jim Jarmusch movie. It offers its customers an illusory experience with other realities behind closed doors. In this case, the hotel is a place with literally backbreaking work for some and meeting rooms for others. And the hotel is a place where inequity, power, and control come to bear. In their design and promise and promotional materials, as you see here, hotels are also aspirational. Over the years, Fred and I researched hotels, and we became focused on several things: the different lives and voices that coexist within the hotel, the way in which hotels signal public and private space and public and private life, and the life of the hotel as a building body. The expansive textual world of the hotel, from coasters to do not disturb signs, were materials that we were taking up. And here in the middle, you see a drawing / poem that we made of our own do not disturb sign. So all of this context to the hotel is what we were thinking about when we were invited to make a project around a hotel for this exhibition called Health Club. And the resulting installation explores the barriers between the hotel's public and private spaces. And there are two discrete projects. The one on the left is a kind of reception desk with a very barrier-like formation that has an embedded registration book. This is basically an artist book with an enormous sculptural prop. And then on the right, you see this floor-to-ceiling composite image of a hotel's demolition. We were looking at the psychology of the hotel through the permeability of its physical structures. So this drawing, this is a drawing that I did at a smaller scale that we then treated kind of graphically like a zine. So each one of these is a page that's from a Xerox machine where I did the drawing and Fred did the math, and this is enormous. on this enormous wall. And what the drawing is depicting is a hotel that's in the process of being demolished. It took longer to demolish this hotel than it did to build it. So it took over a year to tear down this hotel. And here what you're seeing is that the building's facade has been shorn off to expose the grid of rooms inside. And here are a number of 350 sheets of paper that are loosely affixed. And so this image that's unstable is also unstable in space as the image comes in and out of focus as the drawing breathes on the wall. And in case any of you are curious, this is how it was constituted on the wall. And you can see my original graphite drawing, a small segment of it on the right. The other part of the project is reception. And this positions viewers into an encounter with this desk that is the key boundary in a hotel where permission is granted to cross from public to private space. Inspired by single room occupancy and contemporary luxury hotel lobby reception desks, the sculpture can be approached from different vantage points of guest or employee, so guest or clerk. And the artist book that's within the sculpture incorporates original writing and text that we incorporated from hotel rules and regulation to imagine a 24-hour hotel visit. And so as you can see here, people really took this up as a kind of project. And so whenever we went to the gallery, people were often reading, and there were often multiple people reading this book. So we wrote it in 3 voices. As I said, it's a 24-hour book. So to give you a sense of the book's composition and tone, the book begins at 3 p.m., which is when people usually can check into hotels. And there's a voice of the guest, a clerk, and the hotel itself. So the guest voice reads, "Above a body, levitating above your body, a room rounds with voices, smoke-stained curtains, pocked bedspread, hair dryer, hair left in the sink from the body the night before." And the clerk's voice, upside down in the bottom, reads, "And you're more likely to dream and to remember those dreams." And the hotel voice reads, "Higher ceilings, bigger bathrooms, faster Wi-Fi, extended checkout." As the curator described, this book served as a kind of key to the entire exhibition. And with that, I am going to end my talk so we can move into more conversation.
No sé, sigo pensando en las piezas. A mí me gustó mucho la de las lilas y te quería preguntar un poco más al respecto. Decías que trata de la mortalidad, ¿no? Esa pieza, de todos los seres vivos involucrados en esta pared de flores o en esta pared de plantas. ¿Puedes un poco expandir más al respecto?
Bueno, ¿en qué aspecto?
Sobre la mortalidad, pues, ¿no? O sea, un poco
Ok.
cómo se relaciona el texto en específico, tal vez, ¿no? Como
Sí.
idea.
Okay, so something that I'll say is that what I shared with you is an excerpt. So you get just a taste. So the piece is 23 minutes long. So you experienced about a fourth of it. And so just like for anybody who reads poetry and lyrical or prose form, it's not a linear narrative, but with different, maybe to back up a little bit, because I use the word mortality, we were thinking most of all about life cycles, because there's this proximity, there's this beautiful Bill Viola piece where within, I think, a very short span of time, he had a baby born and his mother died. And so this idea that we're always wrapped up in these life cycles and that they operate in these different rhythms, but that this is just part of life. It's the fabric of life. And that during, at different moments of life when I have had some bad accidents and have been close to death, and from a young age begin to think about it in a different way because of it. But life cycles, when we think about these different speeds, that cities have life cycles, that buildings have life cycles, that an insect has a life cycle, that a blossom has a life cycle. And the lilac, I was commenting that the lilac has this very brief temporality, that it's 1 to 2 weeks. So how this showed up in the language is that as an artist, I'm not interested in a one-to-one. I teach a class right now where we were just asked to make work in relationship to poems. And the writer, and I should note that the language that you see, some people think that because I'm a visual artist, my husband is a poet, that he does the writing and that I do all the visual, and that is not true. We actually do build the visual other than drawing entirely together, and the writing is shared. So I can speak in grain about the writing, but that as a writer and as a visual artist, to me, it's far more interesting when there's not a one-to-one relationship. To go back to this project where my class was invited to respond to poems, the other faculty member described our work as illustrations. And I am not interested in that as a teacher or as an artist. I think that the way that different media can activate and expand upon and open up voices and perspectives and work is super exciting. And so the theme of mortality, in a few instances, if you're interested, I'm glad to share the text. In a few instances, we talk about it in really real terms, the way our bodies smell as we age. But we were focusing more on these life cycles. So kind of noticing these details and speaking less literally, but really kind of writing more kind of environmentally and thinking about and using description. So there's a saying in poetry, which is to show, don't tell. So in terms of addressing mortality, while that was the driving thrust of the work, it was less literally it was not about hitting it on the nose, but giving a kind of sensation feeling of this cycle.
Yeah, thank you. It's amazing.
¿Quién quiere preguntar? Sari, bueno, por allá viene la mano, sí.
Mi pregunta es sobre lo que dijo para la composición de la música con el video que nos mostró. Mencionó un poco que se pusieron de acuerdo como en el mood de lo que estaba pasando en el momento del video. ¿Cuál fue la relación que tuvieron con el sonido y el mood? O sea, ¿cómo fue que pensaron qué es lo que tenía que sonar cuando estuviera pasando en el video?
Sí, claro que sí. I'm going to actually back up. And this is mostly for the musicians in the room, but it's for anybody interested in collaboration. So where we began is that we had several meetings where we didn't make anything. We just were like spitballing ideas and saying like, okay, what do we want to think about together? And in this case, they were having us in residence. So Fred, my partner, and I were doing more of the like artistic direction. We were doing more of setting the mood. For the future collaboration, it's going to be more from scratch, that we'll be developing the mood totally together. But what we did is that Fred is also a DJ. My partner is a DJ. I live with thousands of records and I love music. How we met many years ago is through a mix CD club. So what we did is we first put together a palette of music. So we put together like a mood board, but a sound board. So we were pointing to really different music sources. And we shared that with Lisa and Matthew, the musicians, and we went back and forth talking about it and sharing sound. So then they came to us and they were like, okay, when they weren't trying to map a specific sound to a specific image, it was more like the gestalt or the feeling, because these vignettes had very different feelings. So one example is that third movement where I'm swinging the tulips and Fred is watering them. Lisa had written this piece like 5 years ago, and she originally wrote it with toy piano for a Sylvia Plath poem. She didn't know what to do with it. She loved the piece, but it didn't match anything. And as soon as she saw that image, she was like, I know what piece, this is the piece that I want to do. And so what we did is we went back and forth. We're in rehearsal. We, just because of the time, we didn't have a ton of time. They drew from their existing repertoire. And we were then timing things to say like, how does this fit? Does this moment, like, do these 4 minutes feel right with this music? Where does the music enter? How does the music segue? So this is something that I'm glad to talk about in more depth, but I would say that it was in rehearsal that the fabric of the piece came together.
Muchas gracias, Susy.
De nada.
Jennifer, ¿otra pregunta? Bueno, a mí me parece como bien interesante que aparece en tus piezas la relación con la poesía, pero también la relación con la arquitectura, ¿no? O sea, de alguna manera ahí está, de una u otra manera. Y bueno, aquí algunos de mis estudiantes justo estamos entrando pues a reflexiones que tienen que ver con juegos espaciales, desde la escultura, pero también desde la arquitectura y un poco este mashup, ¿no? Entre estas dos disciplinas, ¿no? Y justo estábamos como mucho pensando en el pretexto de la casa, ¿no? Que ha sido un lugar que en la historia del arte pues nos ha preocupado, ¿no? Nuestra relación con los espacios cotidianos. Pero luego la última pieza que nos muestras aparece el hotel, ¿no? Que también es un espacio que habitamos, pero de otra manera. Y ambos como mediados por el desastre, ¿no? El desastre ya sea el de un suceso histórico de desplazamiento que implica ser echado de un territorio para tener que llegar a un nuevo lugar, o en el caso del hotel, ¿no? El hotel en ruina que es edificado y después demolido, ¿no? Y que creo que, bueno, pensando en Chicago, es una ciudad que vive así, ¿no? En la constante demolición, ¿no?
Totalmente, sí.
Entonces, bueno, me interesaba un poquito que nos contaras, ¿no? De esta relación tuya con la arquitectura y con estos espacios en demolición desde distintos lugares, ¿no? Desde el desastre social hasta el desastre del movimiento del temblor, hasta, ¿no? Como un poquito de eso.
Okay, déjame pensar so that I don't respond with like an hour-long response. Déjame pensar. Okay, so empezando con ruina o desastre. So I mentioned that I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I don't know if anybody knows this city or has heard of something called the Rust Belt. But in the US, like other countries, there was a kind of fall of industry. And so there in the city where I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there was a huge steel industry. And that city, when I was growing up, totally failed. It stopped and it was coming to a close. And you could feel it in the city because in the 1900s, the steel mills was so active that people would go out dressed in white and they would come home at noon totally blackened by soot, by pollution, by industry. And when that industry crashed, it left the city depressed. But all of the buildings of the factories were still there. There was just no activity. And so from a very early age, I was very interested in the stories that these buildings had to tell that didn't necessarily have people working in them, but it was in the absence of people where the story was. So as an artist, I'm always interested in negative space. And this is related to a Japanese aesthetic philosophy called ma, which is that the empty space is just as important on the canvas as the full space, as we think about negative positive relations. And for me, this ladders up to the scale of our lives. And so for me, the empty building or the story of the building is a story that can often tell really nuanced the stories of human lives and what we see around us. So some of you might not be surprised to hear that Doris Salcedo is one of my favorite artists, that there are many phenomenal artists who have taken up domestic materials, but also objects. Again, to me, the object can be the scale of the building. Like here is a project that I did called Waterfall that is taken in a hotel. You can't see it, but it's a staircase in this really disgusting hotel in downtown Chicago where the carpet was falling off all the stairs. So it becomes a kind of waterfall. So this idea of where the city meets disaster, that I grew up amidst ruin. And in terms of the quake in Mexico City, I would say that project began out of a set of encounters that I think all of us walk around and carry the histories of the spaces that we've lived, and different things resonate or strike us. And for me, cities, and very distinct cities, because I grew up in Pittsburgh, going with great regularity see my family in Mexico City, and just, where you have to look down at the sidewalk, and where the city comes up inside of itself, on every sidewalk. Again, I'm going to try to keep myself short, and I'm already circuitous. So I won't say too much more, but just to say that the explosive city of Mexico City, the city, the volcanic beginnings, that all of these layers I'm always thinking about in terms of how then ruin, disaster, the object, the buildings it stands in for human relationships, essentially all of my work gravitates around this. And then, Nuria, recuérdame del otra parte de tu pregunta.
Pues yo creo que
Hablando de arquitectura.
de arquitectura, sí, quizá, ¿no? Como para acabar, sí, tu relación con la arquitectura, aunque un poco aquí ya sale, ¿no? A flote, pero sí.
So maybe, I mean, the only thing that I would say too is that sometimes when I give talks, I borrow a phrase from a very interesting writer whose name I'm now forgetting, but the phrase is called kissing architecture. So Chicago is a city that has outsized architecture. If any of you have been, I remember walking down the street and biking down the street and realizing these buildings are enormous. They're far larger than they need to be. And the streets are enormous. They're massive. And some cities deserve the size of the buildings. They need them because of overpopulation, because of who's there. Chicago streets are larger than they need to be. And so this idea of going from the intimate, from a conversation or a dynamic, or how a body holds itself, and then how it is in relationship to the space around us, is something that is very interesting when you start to notice how buildings mandate a certain psychological state. Something that I'll just show you that's behind me is that, speaking of art, this was a project that I collaborated. That drawing is not mine. It's by this name, Amelia, where you might have heard of the publisher McSweeney's, but they ebook that they published that was called The Secret Language of Sleep, that was looking at how bodies are in relationship to, and a book of 39 positions with very funny and sometimes psychoanalytical descriptions of bodies next to each other. And I worked with them to create a game. So if you can imagine a huge museum hall where I was directing program, 3 of these, and then people were making the, and just as interesting as seeing the bodies on the stage in relationship, texture.
Susy, we can't hear you anymore.
But planning and the buildings and cities are never neutral. Okay, that's where I'll end with that one.
We had problems at the end, but I think we got it. No, the game of the bodies, the relationship of
Okay.
movement in the bed. We couldn't hear the end.
Okay. So did you hear me describe that project?
Yes.
The beginning and the very end, a little bit got.
Oh, I think that what I was just saying, did you hear the very end of it or no?
No, the very end. No.
So the very end, what I was saying is I was going back to architecture, and I was saying that urban planning, which I didn't get into because just as much as I'm interested in buildings, urban planning and the design behind it, and often very biased, very racist, very classist ideologies that have built cities in which we live, are very complicated. And things that appear neutral are rarely neutral, but between the human, something as small as a gesture in relationship to something that might appear boring or bland, can really activate in both directions. I said something to that effect.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Susy. Thank you so much. It was important at the end. Someone else? Eric por acá, ¿quieres preguntar algo?
I'm curious about the process that you follow or that you have to find like a common ground between the words and other sensorial experiences. Do you want me to get...
I can't. You're cutting out. ¿Puedes decirlo otra vez?
I'm curious about how is your process to find like a common ground between the words and other sensorial experiences, like the images and the music and all that stuff, because I think there's a really present relationship between like the words and how people react to them with other senses. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about your process in that aspect, because I don't know if you kind of translate from one discipline to another, or they communicate between them, or how is that like really weird journey?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I'll begin by saying it depends. And translation, I use that word, and I think it's a very rich word in this context. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that I think that it is both important to honor what different disciplines can do and offer, and explore and push and press against perceived boundaries. So I heard a couple questions within your question. One of them, if I understand it right, is, tell me if I'm getting this right, but it's about how do I, in a way, think forward to how my audience will receive language. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So there's that question about language, and then there's the question about cross-disciplinary collaboration or developing multimedia works. Yeah, did I get that right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so to talk about the first, it depends is that sometimes, like for any of us making, it can be like drawing in the dark, that we are reaching across a void and we can never fully understand somebody else's imaginary and subjectivity. Without getting too philosophical, what I'll also say is that I'm somebody who's super invested in communicating in a way that does not remain isolated or make work that's only for me or for a limited few. I'm interested in really connecting. And so generally the work that I make can be read or received at different layers, depending on how deeply somebody wants to get into it. I gave you all a deep dive. So for example, I wouldn't expect everybody to sit through a 23-minute text piece for somebody who doesn't like poetry. But what I might think is that they might be very interested in the movement. Think about how you can connect to people. It depends on the project. So there are different projects that never touch language because the goal is really to have other material bridge and be that bridge, and also leave more space for the receiver of the work. Language can activate in a different kind of way, and it's delicious. I love language. I love to write and I love to read in many different contexts. There was this incredible show Ulises Carrion did after the book Dear Reader, Don't Read of his that was phenomenal. And I think his use of language that can be very punctuated and small or to be expansive is really useful. The noticeable effects piece I'm going to use to end my answer to that part of your question, which is to say that for that piece, Fred and I worked super hard to write really short phrases that were strange and interesting, so that people might be like, what? Or, yes, that would also be evocative enough to be super descriptive, but also extend beyond. So very little of the language in that piece is abstract. It's very descriptive, but it's very imaginative and very brief, so that people can enter it and really get a sense of it. That's the poem. And then the visual poem. And then the scores are absurdist, but again, very brief. Like one of the prompts is to call outside the window in a new language. Another one of them is to steady the legs of a table. So some of the instructions very, very literal. So it's really kind of working that span between very clear and direct and more open-ended. I am not a fan of the obtuse or that has an end to lose the body. To jump to the I'll pause. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, in some way, yeah, it does.
Okay, it sounds like maybe we would have a longer conversation. And I'll jump to the other part of the question, and then if other questions, I want to address those, and otherwise we can get back into the language. For the question of multidisciplinary, I answered it in part by saying it's about this movement in like really inviting what different disciplines can do. Collaboration is one of my all-time favorite things to do because I am aware that what can happen in a conversation can yield fruit that never could have happened if I work alone. And that's all the more so when people come to the table with different experiences. That could be life experience, it could be different experiences and perspectives and voices as artists. And by voice, I mean the voice of music or language or the visual or the haptic or somebody who makes perfume or somebody who cooks. What can happen in that space between when we start to invent and think. And for those of us, I'm guessing a number of you in the room are, who do different things, it's always that question of, it's like a good recipe. What's the right balance?
¿Alguien más quiere preguntar una última?
I have a question about the creative process of these pieces, because there's a collaboration indeed, but what's behind the inspiration of those pieces? Like what comes first, like the music, the movement, the poetry, or what is the most like detonant?
Trigger.
Yeah.
What's the trigger in the inspiration to mix all those arts?
So my last statement relates to this, but I'll answer it in two different ways. And you tell me if I'm hearing this right, but part of what I'm hearing in a way is like, what's the catalyst? So in this talk, I've tried to share a bit of what's happening behind the scenes of the work, with you as a room full of artists in a school setting. But what the projects are so different, you know, and with intent, I showed you really different projects. Often my work begins with an encounter. So like the noticeable effects, the text piece began because I saw this visual. So I saw the visual piece of this wind scale, and just the graphic I found to be confounding and sexy in a very milquetoast way, like very boring, but very interesting. And then I began reading it, and the language is beautiful. And I was working on this project, thinking about psychodynamics and relationships. And I immediately thought, I want to take this and make something about the psyche. And I knew that I needed another person to think with because it was an exciting but very complicated idea. And so when I met Fred, a year later, one of our first connections was a studio visit. And he is a person had an understanding that then made me invite him right away to say, will you write this with me? With the work with Eighth Blackbird, because they invited me and Fred to develop something, the language and the images, I would say in that case, the images came first, then the language, then the music. But it could have happened the exact opposite way. There's a very different piece that we did called The Fourth Horizon that you can read about if you're interested. That began with one image, a photograph, and decided that the photograph was of a stage floating in a body of water. And we lived with that image for a year, and then decided that we wanted to populate the stage with sound. And so sound was the driver for that project. So we recreated the stage. It was a very Baroque process. We worked with a sound engineer. we found a telepathy recording and experiment and worked with about 20 people, or we worked with 50 writers around the country to solicit language, then invited about 20 people that included Nuria to record some of those writings, created this very elaborate process. Ultimately, it's a sound piece, but it's a sound piece that is made whole by video. So it depends on the project. Sometimes an image comes, sometimes there is a sound that's like an ache. There's a totally different project that I did called Quick Temblor that Edificios Revisados is related to, but it began because I entered into the space of a seismic shake table and there was a sound like a monster breathing. And it was that sound that began the project. So it depends.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. ¿Algo más?
Anímese. Muchísimas gracias, Susy. Fue un placer ver tu trabajo y tenerte cerca y lejos, pero más cerca que lejos. Ojalá pronto vengas a visitarnos presencialmente. Creo que sería muy lindo poder recibirte acá y conocerte ya en cuerpo.
Me encantaría.
Te agradecemos muchísimo toda la generosidad compartiendo tus procesos. Creo que fue muy enriquecedor tanto para artistas como músicos. Y bueno, pues un aplauso.
No, pues nada más otra vez agradecerte, Susy, y agradecer a todos su presencia aquí. La próxima charla de artista, el 8 de marzo tendremos una proyección de una película de Tania Jimena en la sala de cine del Centro Estudiantil y una semana después vendrá la artista a visitarnos y a platicar. Entonces, bueno, otra vez agradecer a Susy su generosidad y pues muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias a todos y nos vemos, espero.
Esperamos verte pronto.
Adiós a todos, a todas.